Welcome to this episode of Your Next Door Neighbor, where we love to investigate stories of people that live next to us, stories of people that we know. And this episode
we have Adrin Nazarian, who is the Assemblyman from the area that we live, the District 46, California District 46.
It's good to know you're Assemblyman. Very
That's
good
true.
to know you're Assemblyman.
And I met Adrin about 25 years ago. He was a field worker for a local council person, LA council person named Tom LaBange. And I had a coffee house at the time, and he walked in, introduced himself, asked if there was anything I needed. And I just remained friends with him, and he's just a great guy.
And he's got a great story, too. Yet one more amazing American immigrant story. I mean, we seem to run into them all the time. This is what America's about.
That's right, a country of immigrants.
Yes, a country of immigrants. My parents are immigrants, your parents are immigrants, grandparents.
My grandparents were
Grandparents are immigrants.
Well, my mother moved from Mississippi to Chicago.
That's
That was some kind of
that's
migration.
immigration. Well, enjoy this this episode.
My name is Adrin Nazarian. I'm the assembly member for the 46th district.
And where were you born?
I was born in Tehran, Iran.
Wow.
Wow, your parents obviously were emigrated from Iran?
I immigrated from Iran.
Oh, so your parents are still there?
My parents, well, it's a bit of a longer story. We actually ended up coming piecemeal. Took from about 1979 all the way to about 1985. Took about 6-7 years, roughly. My dad couldn't leave. When the revolution broke out, my father thought that it was most likely not going to lead to anything severe. But my sister at that time was leaving to come to the United States to start her undergraduate degree here. My father, in the late 40s and early 50s, came to the United States from Iran, got his bachelor's degree, went back to Iran, and was a very successful architect. So he wanted to do the same with his children. So my sister, who was about to become a senior in high school, came here to finish her senior year of high school in the United States, and then go pursue her degree, her bachelor's degree. But with...
Hang on just a second. How old were you when
the revolution? When the revolution? 6.
You were 6?
Yeah.
So you were conscious, it's like a borderline age of being conscious of what's happening politically around you and for your parents and...
Politically, you'd be somewhat conscious, but when there's a war and people are getting shot and dying, you remember it well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so what was that like? I mean...
It was horrific.
Horrifying.
It was very scary. I don't even think when you're a kid, you don't really understand the extent of how scary it is, because you don't know exactly how, you're not really thinking about the long-term impacts. You just know that there's major significant events taking shape that scares you. When you see things live on TV that's happening just blocks away from you, it's... everything is turning upside down on you, because Iran was a very comfortable country.
And were you watching the fear in your parents, though? I mean,
absolutely. That drives it even more, because there's a sense of insecurity. What are they going to do about their kids? That's their whole concern, and we're trying to figure out why are they so worried about what's going on. And so the more closer it got, the more you would see the protests and rallies from the balcony of where you lived, and you saw it just right down on the street, or when you saw militant folks driving their jeeps up and down, countering the army. When you saw the police, you didn't know whether the police was going to be with the civilians, with the protesters, what was going on, because there was just a lot of change taking shape. And then you saw a religious core kind of rising up that wasn't there before necessarily. So all of it in a very short period of time was very scary. Now, the reality is also I was only 6 when this started. By the time I left the country, I was 8. So it's not as if I had so much context. But when my parents, who have been living there for a long time, see everything change and become very worried, you pick up on that energy. So, it was.
Because you were saying Iran was comfortable.
It was.
And so what was it like before the
Oh
revolution?
my God, it was wonderful. We would. I remember playing hide and go seek at 5. I'd be out in the streets. I mean, it was a very safe, comfortable environment. We would be doing things that I would never allow my kids now in the safest of neighborhoods to be doing. Partially because there's so much intensity in our lives. People need to get from one place to another, so they speed through the streets that they're supposed to be driving a maximum of 25 miles per hour on. The streets are not well lit. Anyway, not to get into the details of things, but it was just comfortable. It was a very comfortable environment. And again, kids from all over the neighborhood would come in and we'd play up until late hours of the night.
Yeah, I
Now,
think that was
you
part
were
of the
saying your
time.
sister.
It was
In any country at that time, it was part of the time. But I can totally relate to what it is that you're saying.
I think the best way I can describe it, especially now that I live in a neighborhood where I see how short the walls are between neighbors, and we talk to each other over the wall. I feel I can't help but to compare it to the Wonder Years series, and say that life was like that in Iran for me, and so it wasn't probably too different than for kids growing up in the San Fernando Valley in the 70s and early 80s. So it's unfortunate that we've all lost that to some extent.
So I want to continue the thread about your sister. Now,
Yeah.
your sister came here to finish high school. Who did she stay with?
So she got here and she was staying with a family that my parents had established a relationship with. I think, but my aunt shortly after that came to also live here. So she moved here. She got a job, and so my sister lived with my aunt. I just can't remember the chronology
Right.
exactly of who came first, but I think my aunt followed very shortly. But then once the revolution, between the time my sister got here to the time of the war in 81, the revolution kind of sped up. And when we started realizing early 81 that we're going to go to war with Iraq, my mother got my brother out of the country literally overnight, took him to a boarding school, an Armenian boarding school in Cyprus, which ironically was founded by 2 Armenian brothers who had survived the Armenian genocide of 1915. And when they had resettled in Cyprus, they decided to put their wealth towards the end of their lives to building this safe house where in future upheavals, any child can come and attend school there. Ironically, it saved a lot of Armenian kids' lives, young men's lives, who had to flee Iran in the late 70s and early 80s because of the war. So my brother was 16 at the time in 81, fled, went to Cyprus. My mother took him to Cyprus, came back, and by the time she got back, the attacks had started and intensified. So it took her another 6 months, actually longer, I think, about maybe 7-8 months, to finally get me out of the country.
And where did you go?
We ended up, so we kind of went a circuitous path. We went to, the goal was to come to the United States and join my sister here, but we couldn't get visas. So we went through Syria to Cyprus to Germany, and then from Germany, we eventually got visas and came to the United States. Yeah, I think in September of 81. Yeah,
It makes
September
me think
5th.
about the current situation with people trying to come here over the border. I mean, the United States was always the last resort, like the place for people to go. You certainly identify with that, right? I mean,
Very much so. Not only just from south of the border, but also from everywhere. You know, when the Muslim nations ban was put into place through an executive order last year, what was really interesting to me was there was absolutely no thought put into that, because it did not alleviate or allow for minority groups who may be leaving those countries. And now I'm not saying, I need to say this in a way where it makes sense. It was done so quickly that it wasn't even given thought of, well, who is it that we want to allow and who is it that we don't want to allow? Because it's one thing to not allow potentially members of ISIS to utilize the opportunities from these countries to come to the United States. That's one thing, I get that. But what about minorities of different races or religious backgrounds who maybe even be persecuted? The Baha'i in Iran were persecuted. And for them to leave and come to the United States we should have welcomed them with open arms. How we've always needed an enemy. Part of it is humanity, but part of it is just how we've become a country that we've become as the United States of America. During the Cold War era,
to change that.
During the Cold
Assemblyman.
during the Cold War era, it was the Soviet fear. And then at some point when that broke down, we needed to find a new enemy. And so it's been these ideas that we've made into enemies, because it's difficult to pick a war with an idea.
Right.
You can defeat a human being, but an idea, you can't.
So you're in Germany. You get to the United States.
Yeah.
Then
How is that? Do you fly? Do you take a boat?
We got on a flight. We
Uh-huh.
came to the States.
Right.
So my sister and my aunt were already here, of course. So we had a place to stay.
So you come into the airport and you have to go through customs. What was
Yep.
that experience like? You're 8 years old. Was there fear involved? Like maybe they may not let us in, or was that even part of your?
Not really. And it's interesting. Well, so it's interesting you asked that, because that's that was the exact torment I was going through a year and a half ago when the ban was put in, because all of a sudden I couldn't help but to think of my background and walking here with my mother at the age of 8 and then being turned back around and being placed on the airplane to have to go back. It would have been exactly people like me having to go back. So that's why there's on so many levels, this was not well thought out, and it was just horrible in its execution and horrible in its intent. No, we came here, and when we stepped off the plane, of course, you're anxiously waiting to see your family. So that was the first thing that was on my mind, as much as I can remember. But the main concern was when we were in Germany trying to get our visas to come to the United States. That was when it was a bit of a heart-wrenching period, because we would go to the consulate office, and we would, I think it was the consulate office, and we would be rejected. So I think we were rejected twice, until on the third attempt, one of the employees said, welcome to the United States, and stamped it. And that's when I also kind of, at a very young age, learned somewhat about just the arbitrariness of who you talk to. It could be a yes with one person, and it could be no with another person. And so that was an interesting learning experience the first time.
Now, was your dad with you at all?
No, my dad had to stay behind. He couldn't leave, because I don't think we would have gotten visas all at once if he had decided to leave the country as well. So that's why it needed to be done piecemeal.
So you're here in the States. Where'd you go to school?
Okay, if I may.
Yeah.
So your sister is there. She's in high school.
Mm-hmm.
She ends up going to college.
She started college. She went to Valley College. Yeah.
And then, Patrick?
And then you got to start your life here. How'd that go?
We did. So my mother, now this is a woman that had been a salon owner in Iran and had kind of, when she started having kids, stopped doing that and started raising her kids and would from time to time go back. And so she comes here and first things first, goes and gets her license to be able to work at a salon place, and with her limited English, and somehow with spit and gum and whatever else, just manages her way through, gets her license, gets hired at a place where, ironically, I did not think about this until in the middle of my campaign in 2012, when I finally realized that my mother had actually, her first job was at a salon on Magnolia, just west of Coldwater Canyon. That facility is now turned into a cleaners, I believe. But it was in the middle of the campaign. It's really funny how elect campaigns torment you and constantly taking you back and making you reflect about a lot of things. And so one of the nights I was in my campaign headquarters and it just hit me. I visualized how we would exit off the freeway, off the 710, and then head west on Magnolia. And so I realized that when we first got here, my mother actually happened to be working in the district that I'm running for. So in the middle of the night, I had to go drive up and down Magnolia to see if I could recognize the intersection, and I realized it's at the northwest corner of Coldwater. We had just moved here and united with my sister and aunt. We were living in these, and this was another funny thing. We were living in these apartment buildings that were, I think, for 18 and over. I think there used to be apartments until they were either banned or no longer allowed.
Yeah, I can't imagine that being a law now.
That was for just adults. So when the management found out that I had now arrived and joined my family at the age of 8, we had to leave. So I think within 5 or 6 months we left.
And where was this? Do you remember?
This was in L.A.
Somewhere.
Someplace in it. It was like the Hollywood area,
Okay.
south of Hollywood. I think like bordering Hancock Park-ish,
Right.
that area. It was like off of Westminster.
And so this must have been like 84 or something?
This was 81.
81?
Yeah.
81, that's right. Yeah, 81.
So we moved, and that time we moved, I think, to Glendale for a short period of time, well, until the rest of the family actually joined. So we were in Glendale, and then we moved to the Valley. But my mother's job was in the Valley. So what she started doing was working there, and then one day a week she would work from home. And so she started having her own client base of individuals who wanted to go see her directly. And then I think that was Sundays. And then Saturdays she would teach class at a local Armenian school.
I mean,
So-
like teach kids.
Teach kids, yeah. I mean, she was practically working at 3 jobs to make sure that she was kind of managing the finances, and
Because your dad's still in
he's still in Iran.
right?
Yeah.
At the moment, right?
Yeah, and so and at that time, obviously now when you look back and you say, here are these middle-aged individuals who are, very successful in their careers and in their lives. They had a wonderful life in Iran, and yet they are, thrown into this tailspin, and then they find themselves at some point overnight living in 3 different continents, not even 3 countries, but 3 continents. With my brother in Cyprus, my dad and my grandmother in Iran, and my mother, sister, and I, along with our aunt, in the U.S. And so she's trying to manage everything. And as the years are going by, and that day is coming where my brother is going to graduate high school, well, what's going to happen? Is he going to be able to join us in the U.S. or go back to Iran? Because that's a death warrant. He goes back, he's going to be yanked into the military, and it's not going to go well. Because the Iran and Iraq war ended up, over 1 million Iranians lost their lives.
What a terror for your mom.
I remember at that time she had started smoking quite a bit, so I would always hide the cigarette. I couldn't bear just throwing it away because I didn't want to just constantly waste money, but I would want to elongate the frequency of the smoke, so I would hide it, and then if I was asked too many times or whatever, somehow it would reappear. So I think some of those things also kind of help formulate the way you approach things later on in life. But she was managing all that, and eventually my brother ended up graduating from high school, joined us, and then my grandmother joined us, and then my father finally joined us in '85.
So you go to school, and do you speak English at all?
No.
So tell me that process. So what happens? They put you in some kind of special program, or you just plunk you down in whatever grade you're in?
I had to repeat second grade again. So I had a wonderful teacher who was extremely patient and constantly reminded me and made me repeat. And when you were, as a young kid who's the only one who doesn't know English in the class, you want to repeat whatever it is that you're being asked to repeat fast and run back to doing whatever it is because you're embarrassed. And she would, the older I get, the more I remember some of these moments. She would calm me down, make me wait, and repeat it several times so that I would learn, and then allow me to move forward. So I did that, and then but I was in that school for about 2 years, I think 2 or 3 years, and then we moved to the Valley.
You're not the first person we've interviewed who had to learn English.
Yeah.
And one of them said they listened to Mark and Brian every morning on the radio, and that's helped them. I mean, was there something like that for you? Was there a cultural touchstone that helped you learn English?
Baywatch, maybe.
Farrah Fawcett, Charlie's Angels.
There you go.
I knew there had to be something there on the
Charlie's Angels, it's funny, I always thank Charlie's Angels and Three's Company.
That was
Those
good. That was
those were
good.
the two influences.
And John Ritter.
Oh, John Ritter was fantastic.
We're
Yeah.
gonna ask them.
I was going to ask him. Yeah, I was going to ask you something. Glendale,
Yeah.
huge Armenian population in Glendale.
Yeah.
So that you landed in Glendale probably because I think, I don't know, I could be projecting here, but because
No, it was convenient.
there was comfort.
It was comfort. You're right.
There was
You're
comfort.
right. Grocery stores that carry the products you're familiar with. But even then, my mother made sure that, I enrolled in YMCA swimming class. So she constantly wanted to integrate me into the community, so that I'm
You're American now.
exactly, but also broadening horizons, and so no, we did all that, and I was in an Armenian school as well. She wanted to. I think she took comfort in knowing that I was maintaining the language and heritage, but at the same time she felt safe. I think she felt comfortable because in a new environment she didn't want too many things to be new. She wanted to know at least that I was going to an Armenian school, and she was comfortable with that.
But did you go to public school and Armenian school, or just
No,
Armenian school?
no, I just went to Armenian school.
Okay.
And once I started on that trend, I just ended up going all the way through to 12th grade and graduating high school.
And I don't know if you can remember this, but at what point do you feel like you were comfortable with English and started understanding English?
Oh God, within 5-6 months,
Wow.
I was pretty
Youth,
comfortable.
well,
Yeah.
Wow, I thought you were going to say years.
No,
The
no,
brain's pretty tactile when you're
no.
that young.
Yeah, it makes
The
such a
sponge.
difference to immigrate. To find yourself in a new environment where you don't know the language at 8 versus 13.
So let me ask you: Did you have any understanding of America when you were in Iran before you came to America, or was Iran your world? That was it.
No, because we have as Armenians, we have a pretty strong sense of identity. And I think it was all the more prevalent in Iran because of the differences in religion. I think it's easier to be lost as an Armenian in the United States because you're coming into a country that even though the religion isn't officially, there isn't an official religion, but since majority are Christian, I think it's easier to actually blend in. But in Iran, I think the religion, to some extent, ensured you maintain your identity. So that was one thing.
I mean, after the revolution, it was the Ayatollah, right?
Yeah. Which made you feel it even more then.
Right. Well, to us, I think he was a religious fanatic.
That's the way it was painted.
That was
Who knows?
that's
I
the
don't
way.
know.
Yeah, I mean, what do we know? But
Well,
that's
no,
the way
no.
it was painted.
No, but did become a fundamental. I think religion was used as a way to kind of bring the masses together, and there was a religious fanaticism. Yeah, I made quick reference of that initially because I'll never forget, and I can't remember what I can't remember what the act of it was called now, but after the revolution, it was common to see 20 or 30 men in repenting their sins, walking through the streets and with chains hitting themselves on the back.
I've seen that. I've seen
What is
that.
the name?
And-
Flatulation. Yeah.
It's a form of it, yeah, but I
Yeah.
can't remember the exact Iranian
Right.
word and to translate it to English. But it was kind of scary seeing that because
It's scary.
because
Hell,
this
are
wasn't
you
just
kidding me?
a simple whipping of yourself. They would be bleeding. The shirts would be torn, and they would be doing this for kilometers or miles at a time. And so anytime you saw something like that, I recall my mother would just pull over and just look down and ask me to look down so that we weren't making an eye contact or there wasn't anything that might seem disrespectful so that it would get the attention. So we would look down and then we would proceed as they would move on. So when you experience things like that also, it when we came here, I was really relieved. I didn't want to see that.
You're now in a melting pot. There's all sorts of religions, colors, creeds. How'd that
Well,
go?
let me back up, and you made me think of this when you asked me the question. That wasn't the first time being immersed. Yeah, I would do a lot of different things outside of the school environment because I wanted to constantly learn also more about. If there was an opportunity to engage in something, I would do it. So I became, aside from playing varsity high school, for example, soccer, I joined AYSO. I would do things outside of the school context because I always wanted to learn a little bit more and kind of grow that small world that I was in because my class was practically about 63 students. In fact, and I was also very mindful of making sure that I'm not spending too much money because being immigrants, having gone through that difficult time, it just became a part of me. So whereas a lot of my classmates would enroll in private driving classes, I enrolled in Taft during my spring break. And that's how I got my permit and then my license. And that way it turned out to be free. Well, where a lot of my classmates were paying somewhere upwards of like 150 or 200 back in that time, like 1989, 90, 91.
Long time ago.
So it was some time ago. So CSUN was different in the sense where you're just in this very big campus, and it's endless. But it was still flat. And I'm making that comparison versus what comes later, UCLA, with all its ups and downs. UCLA was just a whole other campus. But with CSUN, what was really manageable was that it was the class sizes were relatively small. You had 50 students a class, so it was very manageable. And I was very oriented in going in, getting my degree, and coming out.
And what was that in?
Well, so I was struggling a little bit. I loved math, so I thought I'm going to do something with computer science. But my first class in computer science just did not go well. I was having a tough time. So then I felt, I really enjoyed economics, and economics has a lot of calculus and math in it. Why don't I kind of turn to economics? But right at that time also, what was going on was I just finished my first year at CSUN, and I realized how from the first semester to the second semester, I got priority classes first semester, second semester. First year, second semester, Cal State schools, you go to the bottom of the barrel. So you don't get any classes back to back. So what I started doing was second year on, I get 2 classes at CSUN back to back, and then do part-time, and then go take classes at Pierce College. Wanted to get my studies out of the way, the GEs out of the way, so that then I can come back to CSUN and finish up my school there. And at that time, the young lady that I was dating was at UCLA, so she encouraged me to join her at UCLA. So I transferred out. Very smart, very smart. So I joined her at UCLA, and so ultimately finished. I graduated from UCLA. So I had the that also allowed me the opportunity to take advantage of all 3 of state schools, Cal State, UCs, and community colleges.
You get to UCLA, and that's a beast from
UCLA was very different.
all the other schools.
Why is that? Why do you find it different?
Well, just because just the topography of the campus is overwhelming, because it's not level as Northridge was. So in Northridge, you can stand at one point and see the entire campus, and that kind of gives you a sense of the parameter, and so you kind of know your boundaries and you know the campus.
You can wrap your mind around
exactly,
it
and it
understand what's
goes with
coming.
human control, But it's another thing when you go to a campus where you never see the depths of it, and no one point will give you a clear view of exactly where you are. And in some ways, I actually like that a lot.
That's actually a good metaphor for UCLA, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for people to reach into the depths of invention.
It was. It really was. That's when I started doing research. I was
awesome.
getting
Go
paid.
through
What kind of research did you do?
As part of some grant programs and student assistance, I was able to work on campus and do some research and get paid. So I started doing research on banks being too big to fail, for example. So I would go through all these various articles and write up summaries and start contributing to the overall effort of what the professor was trying to get at. So UCLA was wonderful in that sense. It just gave. I couldn't stop taking classes there. I mean, there was one quarter that I ended up, I think, with about 28 units or 29 units, because it was amazing. Because I was taking language classes, I was taking Near Eastern studies, I was doing like every little thing I can think of. And I changed my major several times, because then I started thinking, well, if I'm going to do economics, how about international economics?
You were doing the research. At what point did you start getting politicized, or did you get politicized at UCLA?
I'm Armenian, of course I'm politicized. I think it started before that. I think I was already taking part in youth groups. I was kind of getting actively involved in different protests. When Gorbachev came to the United States in San Francisco, I was in a group of many activists being bussed on buses to San Francisco. When the Russian Red Army came to perform at the Shrine Auditorium, we all made human chains around it and were ready to get arrested. So some of those things started already from a young age. And then my high school teacher, journalism teacher, ran for office, so I started knocking on doors for her. But I was extremely bashful, so I can only imagine how horribly I did at the doors. And then it's not as if I was ever doing any of this thinking I'd run for office, because culturally, being born in Iran as an Armenian, coming from a country and a culture where not just anyone can become politically engaged and involved, and then going through the war and revolution and everything, the last thing you were thinking was, being politically active or running for office or anything like that. And then especially being born in a country that held U.S. hostages. Are you kidding me? No, I never, and I'm very sincere about this. I never really thought that was in the cards. I didn't even process things that way. But I would still engage. I thought it was in order to be an American, I needed to understand the laws. Like my final sense of acclamation to become an American was to know the laws well, to understand what my rights were, and to be a participant in the process. I didn't want to be passive. I wanted to be very active. And I think part of that also came from just what my family has gone through, generations of my family has gone through, and the fact that because we've been passive in so many places, things have happened to us, and I wanted to be actively engaged.
So you graduate UCLA,
Yeah.
And what's your first work? What do you do?
So at that time, I thought I wanted to go to law school, and I thought I didn't want to just come out like one of my friends did, who would come out of law school and either toil away in this prestigious law firm 80 hours a week, or if they didn't make it into that, come out and have to work in an arena where they didn't give them quite a bit of stability, and no matter what you did, you would have to find a job quickly in order to pay down your debt. So I was just very mindful of that, and not knowing exactly what I wanted to apply law to, I thought, let me take a year and apply to just some kind of a program. So I started researching, and I came across the Coro Fellows program at UCLA. I applied, got in. It's a program that would take 12 individuals into the program for that year and kind of immerse you into the public process, public arena. So all 12 of you together would go through a year long of internships. 1 month it was in a government office, 1 month in a nonprofit, 1 month for a profit business, communications, so in the media outlets, on a campaign. You got to work on all these different places. All 12 of you would work in these places in the same arena, but in different offices. So the government rotation, I was at the city attorney's office, so-and-so was in the county supervisor's office, so-and-so in judge's office, whatever else. So
That
on
sounds
and
awesome.
on. It was a phenomenal program.
Is it still there?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's produced some amazing individuals. Dianne Feinstein did the Coro program back in the 50s, for example. So it's had some very interesting people come out of the program. So I did that, and during that time, I was assigned to work on a campaign for a member, for a gentleman who was running for Congress. At the time, he was on the Board of Equalization. He was running for Congress. It was Brad Sherman. And so I thought, okay, great, let me work on the campaign. So I got assigned for about 3-4 weeks. Started doing a little bit of fundraising for him. Started doing a lot of things that I had not done before. Started helping out with designing mails, and started doing recruiting volunteers and managing volunteers. And so I did that, and I got a flavor of what it takes to work on a campaign and how the process works in the campaign world. And so I continued on with my Coro Fellows program, but the congressman hired me after my program ended. I started working for him. I thought this would be great for my resume. I graduated from UCLA. I did the Coro program. I'm working for a congressman. I'm going to get into the law school of my dreams. But then I decided, I realized working for the congressman for about 2 years that you can work as much as you want in government, but you got to make change at a local level. And so what had happened during that time was, when I was working for the congressman, I would start getting calls from a lot of elderly Armenian parents, grandparents, who needed help with visa-related issues. Their family had been separated. Now they want someone to come in and visit, and they were having a challenging time. So I started helping a lot of folks, but I realized that a lot of them were calling from the Glendale area, and I was working for a congressman representing the Valley. So So that kind of intrigued me as to why their representative was not paying attention. And so I started getting immersed more and more and becoming aware of the political climate in Glendale. And so that's when a couple of friends and I decided, well, why don't we look at Glendale and, see how we can make a difference. There's this huge Armenian community, but only a handful are registered, and even less vote. So what ended up happening was we started saying, well, let's start registering voters. Let's start seeing if people are apt to register
In the American system.
and participate,
You're
because so many folks have come from Iran, where there was a monarchy, Lebanon, where the government was always in flux between the Christian Arabs and the Muslim Arabs, and so the Armenian community always felt kind of like it was stuck in the middle. And in Soviet era, well, you acted like you voted, and the government acted like it was a government. So you had to show to your party leader that you voted and you participated, who you voted for, and so coming from governments like that, you're not really an active participant in democracy. It's much more fear and control based. So we thought, why don't we start registering voters and encourage them to vote from home, and maybe we can get them actively participating. So that's what we started to do. We started registering voters. We saw that it was very difficult, especially when the question of partisanship came in. No one wanted to discuss what party they wanted to be a part of.
And you think you think that maybe is a remnant of the old country?
Absolutely.
Where if you said the wrong thing, okay, well, you're a target now.
Absolutely it was. And so they wouldn't want to participate in that. So we had to try different things until we started realizing, okay, they'll decline to state. And so a lot of people would register. I mean, we probably registered, I don't know what, an enormous percentage of folks who would register as decline to state. Very few wanted to actually register as a party member of any party. And so we started helping folks register, and we didn't want to do anything that would come across strong-arming or anything like that. We wanted them to participate, and we would explain and walk through what participation means.
Wow.
Because a lot of times they would say, well, then am I going to have to do jury duty? Am I going to have to do, is my information going to be passed on to somebody else? And every time they would ask more questions, we would get more hints of what that information meant for somebody else in government having it and communicating. And so that was that issue of control and not wanting anyone, especially folks having had the Soviet background, being very sensitive to that. So it was just a lot of trust building that took place, and I think a lot of folks then started liking the idea, participating. They didn't know where it was going to go. Now the second difficult thing was, at that time, registration forms didn't have that little checkbox that now we have that said, would you like to vote by mail? So you needed to fill out another form. And if you want to do everything on the up and up, you're registering them, having them sign it, giving the bottom portion to them, you're dating it, and then you're submitting it, the registration form, on their behalf to the county registrar's office. So we would do that on a very quick turnaround, and then we would take the application to vote by mail, process them by handing it over to the city clerk and letting them know that we've just submitted the voter registration cards, so please don't process this right away until we've given it enough time for the registration to go through so that these clear. And so everything needed to be kind of explained well, and it was just such a labor of love.
Go, who the hell are you guys?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's like
Absolutely.
So this is the germination of your political participation, and then at some point you had to say, okay, well, I feel like I'm a leader here.
Believe it or not, I still I enjoyed the process of campaigning. I enjoyed giving a voice, especially after we won that election, because no one thought we were going to win that election. We didn't think we were going to win that.
Which was what election?
Yeah.
This was the city council race of in Glendale in 1999. I left my job working for a congressman, which a lot of folks said, "Well, you're crazy. You're here. You are having a job for a
You're
congressman.
Armenian, you're not American,
but-
you got a job.
Exactly,
there's Social Security
exactly.
coming.
And he's part of international relations.
your
That's
head
what you
down.
care about anyway. What are you doing, going and working for in a campaign for a council office where the councilman, if elected, can't even hire you as a staffer? So then what are you going to do?" And I thought, well, that's, it's part of this is, if you really want to make a difference, you got to jump in and take a risk. And I'm young, I'll find something else. So we did this. He ended up winning. It was a shock. But it also taught me organizational life, the power of organizing, the ability to pull different resources together, whether it's not just fundraising, but it's also recruiting volunteers, moving, members in a community, getting them to kind of understand and not just participate, but then help you and become vested in it by going and talking to their neighbors. So what we would do is ask our volunteers, go knock on a door in an apartment building, but then have that person take you to their friends. And so we came up with this like pinball theory.
I think they call that network marketing.
That is that. But I was trying to associate it with some kind of a game. So I said, you imagine you're the ball and you're in this pinball machine frame and you're going from one to the other, bouncing back and forth between everything. And that's how we would get neighbors excited. They would be talking to each other. They would get animated over it and interested. And so in 3 months' time, we registered almost 3,000 new voters in Glendale, in a place where there was roughly, I don't know, maybe at that point 60,000 residents. Only about 9,000 were registered to vote, and only 2,500 would be voting. So it was just dismal numbers. That race, we registered 3,000 new people, and I think about 5,000 Armenians ended up coming out and voting, either 5,000 or 5,500. And the candidate ended up winning, and so that just made me realize that this process actually does work. This is not a monarchy. This is not, a group telling you a party telling you how to vote. This actually works.
This is America.
This you gotta apply it and it'll work. You apply the law and it works. And in that process, I even made a lot of friends at the county registrar's office, because a lot of the especially mature sounding women would want to help you, would want to walk you through the process, because when they were hearing the questions you're asking, they were kind of more willing to also help you, because they saw that you're involved in a process. So that campaign was probably the turning point for me to realize that, not for myself, but this is possible, and why don't I just go ahead and try to help this way and uplift the, different folks in different positions. So at that, then we kind of turned our efforts to a good friend, Paul Krikorian, who ran for state assembly. But Glendale Council to state assembly is just a very different stretch. So much more resources and focus and everything else goes into the assembly race. So we ended up losing that race. But in some ways it was a blessing in disguise, because what it forced me to do was continue staying involved and registering more voters and getting more people at the community college, school board, city council levels elected. And so we continued doing that in Glendale. While I would be working in different offices, in that time I then worked for Gray Davis, a trade and commerce agency in the capital. I worked for a councilman in LA, Tom LaBonge, but all the while still kind of engaged, and folks that I had recruited as volunteers were now stepping up and managing campaigns. And they were the ones recruiting new volunteers. So it just became a very powerful network. And then in 2006, all of those efforts led to managing Paul's campaign again for Assembly, and he won. So then I started working for him as his chief of staff. And then he ran for city council in 2009, and he's been a successful member of the city council. And a lot of folks started pushing me at that point to run for his vacated assembly seat. A lot of folks kind of said, well, why don't you run for this? You've been his chief of staff for several years now. You've organized in this community, so you know the community well. But I was living in the valley at that. I had been living in the valley for a very long time at that point. So my entire adult life was in the valley. So at that point, I said, I'd rather stay with him as a city in the city. I'd rather push somebody else to come in and run. And part of it also is you're looking at the maturation process of a community as well. So we wanted to push for an Armenian female school board member at the time to run for the seat, so that it would kind of also change some of the outlook among some of the more conservative community members in having a female in a high position.
That's not really in the Armenian community, though.
It's changing. It's changing. And at that time, I think this is about 10 years ago now, we were pushing it a little bit too much. But if you don't push, you won't have it materialize.
You were ahead of the curve.
We were trying to.
Yeah.
We were trying to. And our good friend unfortunately lost that race. But she continued serving in the school board where she's been since. But then I continued being chief of staff for Paul in City Hall. It wasn't until the redistricting of 2012 that this seat I eventually ended up running for was carved out. And this was actually meant to be a Latino seat in the valley, but the numbers just never really worked out to be that way. So various iterations of the map came and went, and ultimately what it was settled on, I had, again, several friends reach out and say, well, why don't you said no to that one, how about this one now? We went back and forth. Part of the reason why I didn't want to run also initially, multiple reasons, but one of them was that my wife and I had just been married the year Paul won the assembly race. So, and we hadn't started a family yet. So the last thing I wanted to do was for us to start, for me to run for office, and then while my 1 foot is here, 1 foot there, we're starting a family.
Juggling.
Yeah, I didn't want to. I just thought I'd rather not do that. So at that point, by 2012, Alex, my oldest son, was born, and so my wife and I kind of thought long and hard about it and said, let me take the jump and take a leap and see what happens.
I gotta know. So people come to you and say, we want you to run for this seat, right? What is that? I mean, do people actually come over to your house and you sit down with a group of people? I mean, I see it filmatically, but how's it go? Is that really what happened?
No, that wasn't my experience. I'd have friends call me. I had my longtime the gentleman who was Paul Krikorian's consultant, who were very close friends, say, well, why don't you do this? So it was friends, it was folks that I'd worked with very closely, it was folks that I'd randomly befriended who I one day visited their coffee house and or whatever issue it was that I helped resolve or work with them on. So it was just it was like maybe 2 handful of individuals who randomly said, well, you know what, some took the time to call, some took the time to actually grab a cup of quick coffee. Some called very prepared and said, look, these are the numbers. This makes sense for you to do this.
Okay, so you got it, and you're there. What are you happy about?
What am I happy about?
Anywhere.
You know, there's a lot of things that I'm happy about. You're first of all, you're part of the process of a state that competes internationally at the national stage. So whether it's our social policies, economic policies, our law enforcement, public safety policies, our a whole breadth of different things that we take into consideration or think through or act upon, it's a pretty big deal. Because when you take certain steps, you're not just seen as a small state, you're California. You're the 5th largest economy.
In the world.
In the world.
In the world.
And so with that also comes a certain level of, you also want to be careful with some of the things that you do and the steps you take. You know, it's wonderful to be at the forefront of some things, but it's also, is that stretch possible? Are we able to stretch ourselves and know that that back is going to be filled, or are we going to fall flat?
And so are you saying that this process here is what makes you happy? Is this the happiness?
I love that stuff, actually.
Yeah.
That's the stuff that I really enjoy.
Right.
I enjoy problem solving.
Right.
You know, so how are we advancing what it is that we want to solve? So I try to actually not focus too much on the president and some of the policies that he's pushing, because it's easy to fall into the politicization of the issue. What are the real deliverables? How are we making sure that we're going to have the water delivery system and infrastructure so that we're never beholden to water brokers in 50 years from now, so that we're not paying for it out of our nose, so that we don't have to rely on desalination? What are we doing to clean up our water reservoirs that are right underneath our feet? And we have the 2nd largest in the country naturally existing aquifer, but it's contaminated. What are we doing about transportation so that it doesn't become, in another 10 years, maybe a miserable place to want to live in LA? So that you have people.
I don't think we have to go.
So that look, it can get worse.
Oh, yeah.
It can get worse.
It's going to.
I mean, I've seen the fact that in my short period of time, I say short because 25 years, 30 years is short, but from the time that I was in high school and how long it would take from the West Valley to get into the Central Valley area, or from the West Valley to the East Valley, it's doubled in that time.
Yeah.
That 405 divide has become very difficult because there's more traffic, there's many more cars. So how do you fix that? Well, it's embarrassing that we're the 2nd largest city of the superpower of the world, but we don't have a clean, reliable, efficient rail system. We have something, but we need to grow it, we need to expand it, we need to make it into something that people moving to the valley or moving anywhere in LA say, well, we don't have to buy a vehicle because I can get around easily.
So do you find that the other assembly people in the Senate, that there's some kind of force that people realize this, or does everybody have their own little turf that they're like, well, you guys in LA, that's where you want to live, we're up here in the country and it doesn't really affect us? Or is there more of a consciousness about that we're all here together?
It's both. Both exist. I mean, there are some of my closest allies are folks who have nothing to do with LA, but they want to learn and understand what the issues are of LA. And I, in turn, want to understand what the issues and challenges are in a rural setting where you don't have a hospital nearby, where the nearest clinic is 120 miles away, where it's a challenge on a daily basis sending your kids to the local school, where you're dealing with all these regulations and impacts from trying to do your job as a farmer, but being said that, well, you can't use certain pesticides, or having challenges or these threats. Now, as someone who wants to preserve and protect our environment, I very much want us to move away from some of the ways we're approaching, some of the ways we've been approaching our work for a very long time, whether in the fields or in urban settings. But how do you do it in a way so that it doesn't shock the system, but at the same time it changes the culture enough, informs it so that you're progressing and you're doing things in a different way while, able to overcome some of the costs associated with it. These are all part of the challenges that you try to sort through and figure out. How is it that you want to... In 1990, 91, when I was a senior in high school, 1% of the wealth, 1% of the wealthy owned 7% of the wealth in our country. Only about 27 years later, 1% owns 36% of the wealth. We've allowed that to happen in just 3 decades, after all the hard work we put in breaking up major companies, breaking up major industries. Whereas 1% owned the steel, 1% owned the railroad, 1% owned oil. We broke all of that up, and we went to a place where we had a middle class that was strong, that had enough wealth. The middle class was providing the stability of the country and the stability of the political process. And we've eroded that over time. And we're now going back to where we were over 100 years ago. That's very scary to me.
So let me ask you the final question, I think, which is, where are we going from here? Where do you see the assembly going? Is it something where you feel like things are going to be working more together, or do you see it being?
No, I think we're working together. I think what we're going to need to figure out also are some of the more challenging issues that we haven't really figured out, because you look at the context of California, we're younger than 200 years old. We're barely 170 years old. So, and in that time, as we've been trying to kind of grapple our way, and as the state has grown, what's happened is various thoughts have prevailed. As government, as state assembly, the legislature was part-time, and late 60s it became a full-time body. While it was trying to figure out taxation policy and figure out how to manage the swings up and down of property taxes and the devastating effects that it was having on the residents, the residents reacted, and so passed Prop 13, and that curtailed the ability of the state and the county and local city jurisdictions to be able to provide the services because of the shrinking budget. And over time, as population has increased, you're feeling further and further that tightening of the belt of Prop 13 impacts. And so, now I'm just using that as one example, but the reality is, you look at the state, how big it's grown, and how tenuous its revenue-generating model is. Our state is about to spend a little over $200 billion in this next budget cycle. $150 billion of it being general fund money. $80 billion of that being spent on education. Half of the money is going to education. And yet, of all that money that's being raised through taxes, if you really look at it, of the amount that's coming from our personal income, which is about roughly about half of the state's money comes from the personal income. 60% of the personal income is coming from about 200 families in the state. So roughly about a quarter of all the revenue of general fund money is coming from about 200 individuals, 200 families in the state. When you look at that and you see how tenuous it is based on also market fluctuations and earnings, you know that it needs to change. This is not a sustainable model. And when term limits went into effect in 1990 and the first class, starting from 96 on, the assembly members were in 6-year terms and state senators were in 8-year terms, up to 8 years and up to 6 years. You could see how then no one was really thinking about grappling with these big issues. It was difficult because these things take time. But ever since 2012, when we've come in and we actually have the opportunity to serve in one house up to 12 years if we're reelected, both in the Assembly and Senate, I think it's incumbent on us to now look at how we address some of these big ticket issues that's going to determine what California is going to look like 50 years from now. Because the current model that we have is too tenuous for the size of the state that we have. And just the amount of work and innovation and everything else that's contained in our state. So I think the next big issue for us is going to be how we deal with our tax system.
Well, we want to thank you for spending some time with us.
Yeah, I think so. For sharing your story, and I think really you're the living meaning of what America is for many of us. And we wish you the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell me your story. Tell me where you come from, you. Ya da 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 da.